My wife Lola and I, as you've heard, we're researchers for the website British Jews in the First World War. And it's a really, really good website which commemorates the contribution of British Jews in World War I. The site currently has stories of 2,500 Allied servicemen, as well as many articles and photographs. My talk tonight is about Jewish flyers before and during the First World War. Okay. Right. My talk is about Jewish flyers before and during the First World War. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, much was happening in the world of transportation. First, it was bicycles, and then with the invention of the internal combustion engine, the motor car and motorcycle. And in 1903, the Wright brothers first powered, controlled, and sustained flight. Any advance in one field sparked progress in another. Young men were attracted to flying because it was new technology, thrilling, and involved taking risks. Competition bred progress. Who could fly the fastest or the longest distance or the greatest height? Each development spurred on another, which fed in turn the public's interest in aviation. (1909) can be considered when aviation came of age. That year saw the first international public flying event, an 8-day aviation meeting held near Reims in France, which was attended by 500,000 people. The picture on the left-hand side top of your screen is of the poster for the event, and there's a picture on the right-hand side. Later that year, aviation meetings were held in England at Doncaster and Blackpool and Bournemouth. The Daily Mail offered a number of prizes to encourage aviation. In 1909, Louis Blériot won the £1,000 prize for the first flight across the English Channel. Blériot became world famous, and as a result of his publicity, within a few weeks, he had received over 100 orders for copies of his design. From 1910 onwards, if you wanted to fly, you had to take flying lessons and then obtain an aviator's certificate from the Royal Aero Club. 38 certificates were awarded in 1910 and 129 in 1911. Aviation may have been very popular and exciting for the general public, but it was an expensive sport for the pioneers, and to be a flyer, you had to be wealthy. I have identified 5 young Jews who flew aeroplanes between 1911 and 1914. Sir Victor Sassoon, Robert Weiss, Lieutenant Cecil Hoffnung Marx, Sergeant Joseph Kemper, and Lieutenant Thomas Sebag Montefiore. Lieutenant Thomas Sebag Montefiore had little opportunity for flying as he was posted abroad shortly after being awarded his license, number 93, on the 3rd of June 1911. He was 24 years old then, and he served with the British Army in France, Belgium, Italy, and Germany in the First World War. I'm going to start my talk with Victor Sassoon and Robert Weiss, and I will come to Marx and Kemper when I talk about the war. Victor Sassoon, a member of the Sassoon banking family, was born in December 1881 in Naples, Italy, while his family was en route to India. He was educated at Harrow School and Trinity College, Cambridge. Sir Victor Sassoon was the first Jew to obtain an aviator's certificate when he was awarded certificate number 52 on the 31st of December 1910. He was 29 years old. Some of you may notice that at the bottom of his license picture, he's called himself E. Smith. I don't really know why he did that, because the card below lists his true name. Sassoon was passionate about aviation and flew regularly from Hendon and Brooklands over the next 4 years. Victor was also a member of the Royal Aero Club, and in May 1911, he bought the Universal Trading Company, which provided tuition and supplied aeroplanes and aviation equipment. The following month, he founded the Aeroplane Weekly magazine, which you can still buy today. At the outbreak of war in August 1914, shortly after the departure of the British Expeditionary Force for France, the War Office asked the Royal Automobile Club, the RAC, if 25 of their members, together with their own cars, would be willing to ferry around staff officers and take dispatches. Victor was one of those selected, and he spent the next 3 months driving around northern France in his own car as a volunteer motor driver. In November 1914, Victor enlisted as a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Air Service. Unfortunately, 3 months later, Victor suffered a fractured thigh and a broken arm when a gust of wind overturned his Avro 504 during landing. As a result of the accident, Sassoon was only able to walk for the rest of his life with the aid of 2 sticks. He served for the rest of the war on desk duties. Sassoon was a fan of horse racing, and his horses won the Derby and the Oaks. He is alleged to have said, "There is only one race greater than the Jews, and that's the Derby." Robert Weiss is someone very few people have heard of, but like Victor Sassoon, he was an aviation pioneer. In the picture on your screen, the man with the scarf on the left-hand side top is Robert Weiss. Robert Weiss was a 19-year-old German Jew who was living in Dewsbury near Leeds at the time of the 1901 census. We don't know when he came to England, but we know he worked with his brother-in-law in the family firm Flatlow and Sons, who were rag merchants. By 1911, Robert had become a successful businessman and was a partner in the Anglo-Russian Trading Company of Dewsbury. Robert also had a keen interest in aviation, and in the spring of 1911, he took flying lessons at the Blackpool School of Flying at Filey Sands, which is shown in the top picture on the top right-hand corner. Unfortunately, he obviously was passionate about flying, as Filey was more than 70 miles from Dewsbury. And in May 1911, Weiss bought himself a Blériot monoplane from Robert Blackburn, which would have cost him about £500 to £600, the equivalent of £60,000 in today's money. Flying, as I said, was a rich man's sport. Unfortunately for Weiss, his aeroplane overturned on the sands a week later. I assume it was damaged beyond repair, as there are no records of the aeroplane ever flying again. Throughout that summer and autumn, Weiss was a regular flyer at Filey, piloting the school's aeroplanes. He appears to have had a good relationship with Mr. Blackburn and the school's flying instructor, Hubert Oxley. On the morning of the 6th of December 1911, Oxley decided to make an attempt to win the prize of £50 for the first Yorkshire aviator to fly from the Yorkshire coast to Leeds using the prototype 2-seat Blackburn Mercury 3, which had made its maiden flight a few weeks earlier. This is the plane on the right-hand side picture. As a preliminary test of his aeroplane, Oxley decided to do first a short test flight around Filey. Oxley was already in his seat with Albert Hunt, his engineer, as his passenger, when Weiss asked Oxley if he could go with him instead of Hunt. Oxley agreed, and they took off and did a circuit over the town. When over the houses at the edge of the cliffs, and you can see the picture on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side rather. At a height of about 600 feet, Oxley made a sudden dive towards the ground on full engine power at a speed which was estimated to be approaching 200 miles an hour. The maximum speed of the aeroplane in level flight was 75 miles an hour. When they were 50 feet from the ground, Oxley attempted to level out the machine, but because of the extraordinary strain which the machine had been subjected to, the fabric on the underside of the wings burst with a loud bang, and suddenly the wings ripped into little bits. The machine minus its wings then crashed on the sands. Oxley was hurled from his seat, falling about 10 yards in front of the machine. Death was instantaneous as he broke his neck. Weiss, who was sitting in front of Oxley, had to be extricated from under the engine and was so seriously injured that he died within an hour and a half. Albert Hunt, who had given up his seat to Weiss, told the inquest into the accident that he worked as an engineer at the flying school and that Oxley had held a Royal Aero Club aviator's certificate since May 1911 and had been flying at Filey for 12 days on various Blackburn machines. He had been up with him in the machine which had crashed probably 10 or 11 times. Oxley had made very steep descents on every occasion, coming down at full power at an angle of about 35 degrees from the vertical. The normal method of landing an aeroplane was to cut the engine and glide gently to land. After his first flight with him, Oxley had asked Hunt for his opinion on flying. Hunt warned him of the extreme danger of such descents if carried out from any great height, as he was certain that this machine could not possibly stand the strain when levelling out for landing, no matter how strong the machine was built. Unfortunately, Oxley did not realise how serious this was and laughingly replied, "Oh, I always land this way." Oxley had failed to realise that what he had achieved previously from 250 feet could not be completed safely from 500 feet. The jury at the inquest returned a verdict of accidental death, what we would now call pilot error. 2 lives were needlessly lost that day due to the foolishness of an inexperienced pilot pushing to extreme limits a prototype machine on which he had previously flown only for about 4 full days. Robert Weiss, the successful 29-year-old young businessman who had lost his life needlessly in a tragic accident, was due to be buried in the Belgrave Street Synagogue Cemetery in Leeds, but the family decided instead to return his body to Germany for burial. Robert Weiss was the first Jew to die in an aviation accident. The accident was reported widely, as shown here on your screen now, in the London Times and the Jewish Tribune, which was published in Portland, Oregon in America. Now, let me move on to the war. The Royal Flying Corps was formed in 1912, just over 2 years before the Great War started in August 1914. That it succeeded was one of the miracles of the war. The attraction for the young recruits who were drawn to the aeroplanes was that it was the latest technology and a new type of warfare. They were keen to do their duty for king and country. For them, the thrills of flying outweighed the dangers. I found this quote in the official history of the war by Walter Raleigh. One of the greatest strengths of military aviation in its early days was that it attracted into its service by natural magnetism men of an adventurous disposition. The dangers of the Flying Corps, rather than the good pay that it offered, brought to it recruits strong in all the virtues of the pioneer. No one who covets a life of routine with defined duties and limited liabilities ever took up aviation as a profession. Or as Tom Cruise said in the film Top Gun, I feel the need for speed. This is why young men drive cars and ride motorcycles and fly aeroplanes for no other purpose than to go really fast. The image of a pilot in the First World War was someone from a wealthy background and educated at a public school, which was often true in the early days. This was because the Royal Flying Corps was keen to recruit anyone who had already had some flying experience, and flying an aeroplane, as I have said, was an expensive hobby or occupation. As the war progressed, people from a variety of backgrounds who were considered reasonably well educated would be recruited. But you have to remember that the First World War in the air was a gentleman's war. It was an age of duty, honour and respect. The British pilots regarded the German pilots not as the enemy, but as their opponents. This was the exact opposite of the soldiers who thought nothing of shooting a sleeping enemy combatant. Respect was certainly evident between the pilots. Wreaths and notes would often be dropped over opposing airfields to say that a missing pilot had been captured or had died. When Oswald Bolker, who was known as the father of the German fighter Air Force, was killed in a mid-air collision in 1916, the Royal Flying Corps dropped a wreath which read, "To the memory of Captain Bolker, our brave and chivalrous opponent." We know that approximately 50,000 Jews served in the British forces in World War I, as in 1922, Anglo Jewry published the Jewish Book of Honour, which listed all their names. The book was compiled from the casualty lists published in the Jewish Chronicle, chaplains' records, and the requests from families. 2,485 of the 50,000 died on active service, and over 1,000 received awards and decorations, including 5 Victoria Crosses. The majority of the 50,000 served in the British Army, with only 2,000 in the Royal Flying Corps and 500 in the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy intake was low because they would only accept Jewish men if both they and their parents were born in Britain. Approximately 300 Jews from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa served in the Royal Flying Corps, either as pilots and observers, the remainder serving as technicians, maintaining and repairing the aeroplanes. When the Royal Flying Corps was established in 1912, it was intended to be a joint service, but owing to the rivalry between the British Army and the Royal Navy, it split into 2 wings. The Royal Flying Corps became the Army wing, and the Royal Naval Air Service became the Naval wing. Both services merged in 1918 to become the Royal Air Force. The primary role of the Royal Flying Corps throughout the war was to support the army in France in a reconnaissance role. As the war progressed, it took on new roles, including photographic reconnaissance, the bombing of enemy targets, and gaining control of the air using fighter planes. The role of the Royal Naval Air Service, which came under the Admiralty, was to provide the air defence of the British Isles, and its naval operations included long-range bombing and anti-submarine warfare. When the war was declared in 1914, the Jewish community was very keen to show that they were loyal Englishmen who were willing to play their part. So along with the Jewish press, Anglo Jewry loudly proclaimed the community's loyalty to Britain. You can see on your screen the banner which was outside the Jewish Chronicle offices, which read, "England has all she has been to the Jews, and the Jews will be all they can to England." On the right-hand side, there is a poster calling on the young Jews to serve. As you notice, the top part is in English and it's in Yiddish underneath for the immigrants to read. Captain Cecil Hoffnung Marx was born in December 1887 and was educated at Eton, and in 1906 was commissioned in the Middlesex Regiment. In May 1911, Marx became one of the first 100 people in Britain to qualify as a flyer when he was awarded his aviator's certificate number 83. He transferred to the Royal Flying Corps shortly after its creation in 1912. From December 1914 until March 1915, Marx was based in Saint-Omer in France with No. 9 Squadron, developing the use of radio for reconnaissance missions. He then spent 6 months at Brooklands as a flying instructor and wireless expert, returning to the frontline service on 5th of October 1915 as a flight commander with No. 13 Squadron, which had deployed to the Western Front 2 weeks earlier. At lunchtime on 23rd of October 1915, this BE-2C, flown by Captain Marx and his observer, Lieutenant Will Lawrence, the brother of Lawrence Arabia, were on an escort and reconnaissance patrol. They were shot down west of St. Quentin by German ace Hans-Joachim Boudicca. The deaths of Marx and Lawrence just 4 days after their arrival in France were the first 2 casualties suffered by 13 Squadron. The loss of Marx was particularly serious as he was the squadron commander. He was only just 28 years old. The plane in the bottom right-hand corner, number 2017, was his aeroplane, and the picture next to it is of the crash plane. The 2 men were initially posted as missing until confirmation of their deaths came in March 1916, when the Marquis of Winchester, the executor of Marx's estate, received a postcard and letter from the National Bank of Germany in Berlin. On the card was marked the position of the 2 graves in the German soldiers' cemetery at San Quentin, where Marx and Lawrence had been buried 3 days after they were shot down. After the war, their bodies were reburied in the British War Cemetery at St. Souple. The story didn't end there, because in March 1919, sworn depositions from the Commissioner of Police and the town clerk of San Quentin alleged that the 2 airmen had been killed after landing by the Germans because the 2 French officials had inspected their bodies before burial and saw that their clothes were riddled with bullets and their boots and hands were soiled with mud. This, they suggested, indicated that there had been a struggle on the ground rather than that the 2 airmen had died in a dogfight. The German pilot Boudicca wrote about the air combat in his book, which was published after his death in 1918. He said that they pulled a dead body and 1 dying person from the plane. It seemed to him that Marx had brought the plane down to earth with his dying breaths, while Lawrence was already dead. The 2 depositions are in Lawrence's service file at the National Archives, as well as a couple of other memos discussing whether to take the matter any further. In the end, it seems, it was decided to take no further action. The honour of being the first Jew to serve in the Royal Flying Corps went to Wing Commander Joseph Kemper Mbe, who was transferred into the Royal Flying Corps from the British Army in 1912, 6 weeks after it had been formed. He went on to serve for another 33 years and was one of the handful of Jews who served in both the Royal Flying Corps in World War I and the RAF in World War II. Joseph was born in 1886 in Odessa in Russia, where after leaving school he trained as a cabinet maker. The family came to Britain in 1903 and settled in Hull. He had not really intended to sign up, but at the age of 18, like many adolescents, he had an argument with his parents and walked out of his home in a bad mood. He went into town and was standing outside a shop from which a man came out and said to him, "It's a fine life, isn't it, son?" To which Joseph replied, rather sarcastically, "Bloody fine." What Joseph had failed to notice was that the shop was an army recruiting office, and before he realised it, he had enlisted in the army and joined the South Lancashire Regiment. His parents could do nothing about it, and that was the start of his 41 years' service in the Army, the Royal Flying Corps, and the RAF. In June 1912, Joseph transferred into the newly formed Royal Flying Corps 6 weeks after it had been formed, because his woodworking and metal working skills were needed by the Royal Flying Corps to maintain their aeroplanes. He joined No. 2 Squadron at Montrose in Scotland, which was the first aeroplane squadron in the Royal Flying Corps, as No. 1 Squadron flew balloons. Even though he was a mechanic, he learnt to fly and was awarded his aviator's certificate in April 1913. Joseph was a chief mechanic when the squadron deployed to France at the outbreak of war in August 1914. Although he didn't know it at the time, he was to spend the entire war in northern France. Even though he was a chief mechanic, Kemper regularly flew throughout the autumn of 1914 as an observer on reconnaissance missions. The London Gazette reported on the 24th of February 1916 that Sergeant Major Kemper, as he was then, had been awarded the Médaille Militaire by the President of the French Republic in recognition of his distinguished service during the campaign. This was very unusual because he was an NCO and not a pilot. Nobody knows why he received the medal. However, there is a story about him which I found in the archives which might explain why he received this award. After the Battle of Mons in 1914, the Germans were advancing through Belgium into northern France. The story goes that Kemper was on a test flight when he noticed the German military had left the front in Verdun and was surrounding Paris from the northwest. Once he had realized that, he reached out to the French commander, Marshal Foch, and explained it to him. Foch did not believe him because it contradicted the information he'd been given. Kemper then took Marshal Foch up in a plane and proved to him that it was true. The result was that Foch moved his army to intercept the Germans and was hailed as a hero for saving Paris. After their success, the French generals congratulated the Royal Flying Corps for their reconnaissance work. Although I have been unable to prove if this story is true, I would like to think this is why he was awarded the Médaille Militaire. In 1916, Joseph was commissioned as an officer and posted to the aeroplane supply depot at Saint-Omer, where he was responsible for the supply and repair of all the Royal Flying Corps' equipment, which included aircraft, wireless equipment, and vehicles. By the end of the war, as Major Kemper Mbe, he held a senior position at the Saint-Omer Aircraft Park. Joseph went on to serve in Egypt and Iraq before retiring from the RAF in 1931. During the 1920s, as the senior Jewish airman in the RAF, Joseph laid the wreath at the annual Ajax marches in Whitehall. He is pictured here in this 1928 picture with Henry Jessel, a Jewish soldier who fought in the Crimean War in the 1850s. This, for me, is an amazing picture, as Jessel was 97 at the time. Joseph, who was a Zionist, went to Palestine in 1935 as chief engineer for Carmel Automobiles, which had opened a factory to assemble standard cars in Haifa. Production was halted the following year after only 20 cars had been assembled because of the Arab uprising against British rule in Palestine. In 2014, the Israeli Post Office issued this stamp to commemorate the building of the first cars in Palestine, which is the picture on the right-hand side at the top. Kemper also worked for the Haganah, training pilots both in Palestine and Romania. His cover story was that as Major Kemper, he was in charge of the RAF base at Ramla airfield. This, of course, was not true. Every 2 weeks, he traveled from Haifa to Kibbutz Degania to teach a group of Jews the principles of flight in the roof space of a cowshed. As Kemper was very well connected with the leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine, and because of his cover story, no one questioned him when flying one of the few privately Jewish-owned aeroplanes in Palestine. The picture marked J at the top there shows him with a mechanic in front of this plane. One day on a flight from Haifa to Atlit with one of his pupils, they had engine trouble and the plane got caught in telephone wires near the Carmel station and crashed. The two men escaped injury and Kemper immediately disappeared, leaving his pupil behind. Within minutes, however, Navy, Air Force and Red Cross vehicles appeared on the scene. Then all of a sudden, a big black car appeared, and in the car was Joseph and David HaCohen, a leading member of the Jewish community in Palestine. David HaCohen used his influence with the British. Some whiskey and cigarettes and a few pounds changed hands, and nothing further was said about the crash. Although Joseph had returned to Britain in 1938 to rejoin the RAF, his lectures to the Haifa Aero and Gliding Club were noted in this article in the Palestine Post of January 1939. Joseph served throughout the war at Greenock, and as Wing Commander Joseph Kemper was awarded the OBE in 1944. His daughter told me that in the autumn of 1945, her father suffered a heart attack, and when it was obvious he would not survive, she phoned Lord Trenchard, the founder of the RAF, who had been Kemper's commanding officer in No. 2 Squadron, to see if he could arrange for her brother, who was serving in Kenya, to come home. Although war conditions still prevailed, he was home within 24 hours. Joseph Kemper died a few days later and was buried at Willesden Jewish Cemetery with full military honours. I will now turn to Lieutenant Albert Abraham Robinson, who was a balloon observer. But before I tell his story, let me just say a few words about the Royal Flying Corps artillery observation balloons, which operated close to the front line, as their job was to observe Allied and enemy gunfire and positions. The balloons were attached to winches, which hauled them into position, and were linked by telephone to the various batteries in their area, as well as the company HQ. Being a balloon observer was dangerous work, as they were frequently attacked by German aeroplanes. Unlike pilots in the Royal Flying Corps, balloon observers were equipped with parachutes, and many observers were forced to escape from their balloons using parachutes. The second balloon wing of the Royal Flying Corps made 106 emergency parachute descents in 1 year of operations at the front. Parachutes were not worn on the observer's back, but were packed in conical containers attached to the balloon's basket and linked to the observer by static lines. You can see them in the picture on the left-hand side. Most of the time, the parachutes worked, but unfortunately, sometimes they did not. Lieutenant Abraham Robinson was born in April 1889 and was working as a commercial traveller before he obtained a commission in the 7th King's Liverpool Regiment. He was a very brave man, winning the Military Cross at the Battle of Menin Road Ridge in September 1917. The dedication there reads, "For conspicuous gallantry, for devotion to duty, when he took command of his company when 3 senior officers had become casualties and gained the objective under very adverse conditions. Albert was awarded a bar to his military cross in January 1918, when in the course of some very heavy fighting, Albert again found himself the only remaining officer of the company. Although a junior officer, he took command and captured the objective against intensive machine gun fire. In front of him, he saw a trench occupied by the enemy, threatening the captured lines. He forthwith advanced with 4 men, in spite of heavy fire, and took prisoner 3 German officers and 30 men. For 3 days, he held his position until relieved. Albert Robinson had set a very fine example to the men under him, but with his determination, courage, and cheerful disposition. I have the greatest admiration for this man, because what makes someone who had survived several years of trench warfare and had been awarded the Military Cross and Bar for gallantry want to become a balloon observer? He was twice wounded, and on returning home to England, he joined the Royal Flying Corps, and after training served with the 5th Balloon Corps Balloon Company from June 1918 onwards. 3 months later, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for bravery and devotion to duty as a balloon observer when his balloon was attacked by enemy aircraft and was forced to make a parachute descent. He then went back up again immediately in another balloon to carry on his observation. The citation noted that in August 1918, he had been forced to parachute from his balloon 3 times. It was reported that at the start of the Battle of Amiens, Albert, along with a colleague, were hoisted aloft at 6:30 p.m. on the 8th of August, 1918, despite experiencing heavy German anti-aircraft fire in their stretch of the sky at 3,000 feet over no man's land. Their balloon caught fire without warning 2 hours later. Both men jumped and their parachutes worked perfectly. His colleague later recalled that the ground crew was shaking. The buggers have done it again, and they were shaking their fists in the air. The balloon had been hit by friendly fire. The culprit was later identified as a Royal Flying Corps fighter flown by Major Sholto Douglas, who later became a Marshal of the Royal Air Force. Excuse me. We shall never know if Albert received his Distinguished Flying Cross as a result of friendly fire. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find anything further about Albert other than that he was discharged from the RAF in 1919. I now come to Marcus Casa, whose family moved to Liverpool in 1902 when his father Meyer was appointed the head of the Hebrew school there. In 1916, Marcus joined the Royal Flying Corps and after training was posted to number 18 Squadron. He arrived in France on the 11th of April in the middle of the Battle of Arras, in what came to be known as Bloody April, because of the heavy casualties suffered that month by the Royal Flying Corps. 250 aircraft were lost and 98 of the 262 casualties were killed in action. On the 7th of May 1917, just 27 days after arriving in France and with only a handful of successful missions under his belt, the FE-2 biplane flown by Second Lieutenant Casa and his observer, Sergeant Russell, was hit by enemy fire whilst on a photography mission. Even though the plane was on fire and Marcus was injured, he managed to land and was captured. He became a prisoner of war at Stettin, Augustabad, and Schweidenitz prisoner of war camps. We are very fortunate to have copies of the 200 letters Marcus wrote to his family during his 18 months of captivity. They provide an extraordinary insight into his life as a prisoner of war. Under the Hague Convention, captured servicemen were entitled to treatment in line with their rank and board, with lodging and clothing comparable to that of their captors. Officers were not required to work. Marcus received 50 marks per month from the German government, of which 30 went towards his keep. On his arrival at Stettin prisoner of war camp, he wrote to the American Express Company in Berlin and received £5 inside a week. He also arranged to receive £5 a month from his bank, Cox's, in Pall Mall. The postal service in World War I was excellent, as he received over 50 parcels in that 18 months. His family sent him warm clothes, artist materials, biscuits, cake, chocolate, sweets, and cigarettes. And Mrs. Melchior in Copenhagen sent him fresh food, such as fish, bread, fruit, milk, and butter. He wrote to his parents about what had happened when he was shot down. My engine at 10,000 feet was hit in a fight. I was then 12 miles over the lines and tried to glide back. I was then attacked by another 3 machines, and they had me under fire until I reached the ground. I kept stunting to upset their aim. My gun had jammed at the start and thus could not quite reach the German lines. I got a bullet through my upper arm at 3,500 feet and continued with one hand. I started to burn at 1,200 feet, and then I crashed into the enemy's second line, and my observer pulled me out and we surrendered. If ever any man came back from the valley of the shadow, I am he. It was a pure act of God. I wasn't riddled. One bullet I saw go through my windscreen. I could hear them hitting the engine all the while. I'm very lucky indeed. The FE2 plane, that is a picture of the plane he was in, and his observer sat in front of the pilot with a gun. The picture on the right-hand side is from his time in the prisoner of war camp when he was still injured. His arm was healing. He continued with his letter. I must confess that I shouldn't have crossed the lines on May the 7th, as my machine was straggling behind the formation. I had an hour's chat with Lieutenant Walter Nielsen, who shot us down. He was a very good chap, but I regret that I did not ask him to drop a message in the English lines that I was all right. The Germans treated Marcus very well as a prisoner of war, as he was allowed to go for walks in the countryside, and every Saturday was allowed to go into town to attend services at the town's synagogue. He wrote, "On the New Year, I went to the synagogue in the town. There are no other Jewish officers here, or at least no professing Jews, but there is a Russian sergeant major, one of the orderlies, who came with. It was a nice homely service, not nearly so grand or elaborate as the Stettin shul, but an ordinary foreign service. I liked it very much. It was only a little shul, and the sermon, davening, and everything was done by one cousin. They gave me several mitzvahs, a call-up, and the opening of the ark. As it was every officer's duty to try and escape and return home, Marcus wrote coded messages in his letters to his parents asking for their help. The British authorities soon realized what he was up to, and they told his father they would be glad to help, and as a result, they sent him parcels containing items to aid escapes, such as wire cutters. This was one of his messages. As you know, Mr. Mercator has promised to send me some large coloured pictures. I haven't received them yet. I hope you have arranged with him which kind to send. You know exactly the 2 kinds I prefer. Quite artistic, though both exactly opposite in design. He gets them from Messrs. A.T. Lass and Co. I much enjoy the packets of Quaker Oats you sent me." What Marcus was asking for was maps, as maps use Mercator projection. He frequently mentioned Quaker Oats in his letters, which indicated they contained the various items to help him escape. One of Marcus's 3 escape attempts was from Schweidenitz prisoner of war camp in East Germany. Within the camp was a sunken rectangular courtyard in which they were permitted to exercise. Overlooking the courtyard and the toilets were elevated platforms on which the sentries were posted, so that the entire camp was at all times surveyed by the guards. The sentries were changed at midday. During the morning, Marcus paid several visits to the toilets, on each occasion concealing on his person parts of his escape kit, which he hid in a toilet. The last visit was timed for 2 minutes to 12, at which time he entered the toilets in his ordinary uniform. At 2 minutes past, when there were different sentries from those who had seen him enter, Marcus emerged as a German workman with his face sufficiently dirty to fit the part and to prevent recognition. He was now carrying a small bag of tools. He then very deliberately dismantled and cleaned and reassembled 2 sections of the ventilation pipes running up the wall from the toilets. The sentries watched him at his work with mild interest. When he had finished, Marcus nodded to the sentry, indicating that he must do the top part of the pipe as well. The sentry nodded back, so Marcus climbed slowly up the ladder. The sentry said something to him as he passed, and Marcus grunted a few words of German in reply. Once again, he repeated the operation, taking some 20 minutes over the job. As the sentries were now quite used to his presence, when he had finished his work, Marcus collected his tools and walked off through the allotments. Unfortunately for Marcus, it was only a matter of hours before he was recaptured and returned to the camp for a period in solitary confinement. Marcus was repatriated to Britain on the 25th of December 1918 and was mentioned in dispatches as a result of his escape attempts, and was also awarded a bar to his Distinguished Service Order. He served in the RAF during the Second World War, playing an active part in planning the Dunkirk, Dieppe and D-Day operations, and was again mentioned twice in dispatches. Marcus was promoted to wing commander and in 1945 was awarded the OBE. He died in 1984. I will finish with one of the most tragic cases I've come across. It involved Australian cousins, Flight Lieutenant Cyril Whelan and Flight Lieutenant Alwyn Levy. Cyril was the son of Albert Whelan, whose real name was Albert Waxman, and Alwyn was the son of Bert Levy, who had married Cyril's sister, Harriet. Although Albert and Bert were well known in the literary and theatrical world in Melbourne, Australia, in the 1890s, both men left Australia to seek success elsewhere. Albert, who changed his name to Albert Whelan, came to Britain with his son Cyril to pursue what turned out to be a very successful career as a film actor and music hall performer. Bert, however, emigrated to New York with his son Alwyn and became a writer and producer in the movie industry. Alwyn Levy was born in March 1897 in Sydney, Australia. In November 1917, when he was in his second year of studying engineering at Columbia University in New York, he decided to enlist. As an Australian citizen, he was unable to join the American Army and had to travel to Toronto in Canada to enlist in the Royal Flying Corps. Alwyn graduated from the Royal Flying Corps' Canadian School of Aerial Gunnery the following February after 25 hours of solo flights. On the 23rd of March 1918, he was posted to the Royal Flying Corps' 42nd Training School at Weiss Aerodrome in Kent. His cousin, Cyril Whelan, who was 2 years younger than Alwyn, was educated at St Edmund's College, Ware. He was 18 years old when he enlisted in the Royal Flying Corps in March 1917 and was their youngest flyer and a very gifted aviator. Over the next 12 months, he had advanced to stunt instructor, having gained a wide experience on a variety of aeroplanes. He joined the 42nd Training School at Weiss in January 1918 as an instructor to train British and Canadian pilots for the Western Front. Tragedy struck at 6:45 p.m. on the evening of Friday, the 25th of April, 1918, when Alwyn, who was under instruction in aerial fighting in his Sopwith pup, collided in midair with an Avro 504 trainer flown by his cousin Cyril. We are not sure what actually happened, but it appears that the collision occurred while the cousins were attempting to signal each other. Their willingness to serve their king and country had reunited them after 15 years apart, and within weeks, both of them were dead. Alwyn was 21 years old when he died and was buried at Willesden Jewish Cemetery. And Cyril, who was 19 years old, was buried at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Kensal Green, Brent. Their deaths were a tragic loss for not only their parents, but also for the Levy family in Australia, as only a month earlier, another cousin, Sergeant Albert Levy, who had won the military medal, had been killed in France. This picture shows a brandy bottle belonging to Alwyn Levy that was found after his death. I will finish here, even though there are many more stories to tell. Each person has their own story, and no two are the same. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Can you stop screen sharing so that we can all see each other?
Yeah, I will. Hang on. And show. Find it. Stop share. Right. Yeah.
Right. Well, Dr. Ronnie Fraser has very kindly agreed to a Q&A and any comments you might wish to make. So if you want to raise your hand, if you have something to say, please do so now. Anyone? No one? Mr. Phillips, yeah, you had something to tell us earlier. Would you like to repeat what you said? Maybe you could unmute yourself. Right.
Oh, yeah, I have unmuted myself, but unfortunately it's not relevant to this particular lecture, which I thoroughly enjoyed and was very interested in. My congratulations to Ronnie Fraser. I think it was wonderfully administered. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. What Mr. Phelps had asked me before, his wife had mentioned that his wife's uncle was a pilot in World War II. I've concentrated on World War I for my research.
Yeah.
But there is another website which, if you search on the web, is for Jewish members, Jewish personnel who served in the RAF in World War II. And the lady who runs that is gradually working through names and putting details up on the web. She's at the moment concentrating on pilots who died, or navigators or crew who died, but will eventually widen it out to take people who survived. So if you have any information, anybody can come back to me either through Spencer, or you can come back to us through the British Jews in the First World War website, and I will be glad to pass the name on or details on, or answer any questions from anybody after this event.
Yeah. Susan, have you got your hand up, Susan? No. Well, maybe you can tell me how Jewish pilots were treated by their fellow pilots. Were they ever seen as Jewish people, or were they just part of the general flying corps?
And it's an interesting question. I mean, there was anti-Semitism in World War I, because the majority of Jewish immigrants were not allowed to sign up and serve because they weren't British citizens until 1916, when the government, I believe, said that it was my wife is just telling me it was 1917, not 1916, right? Because the Russian, at the time of the Russian Revolution, before the Russian Revolution, you could only serve if you could serve in the country of which you were born in, which you had citizenship. And so what happened was, if you wanted to serve in World War I, you could, and you were a Russian immigrant, you had to serve in the Russian army. Now, if you fled from Russia because of anti-Semitism, because of pogroms, you wouldn't want to go back. And so as a result, there were, I think it was about 100,000 Jews living in London, and the Jewish community in Britain at 1914 was something like 250,000. There were an awful lot of immigrants who had come from Russia that were not allowed to serve. And the British public were very sort of anti-Jewish, because these men were not serving, and while the British citizens were dying in France. And there was anti-Semitism. I believe there were some riots in Leeds, and I believe also in South Wales. So it was a difficult situation. But after the Russian Revolution, they allowed Russian citizens to join up the RAF. And I have actually come across a case where a Russian Jew was serving in the RAF, and he was undergoing training, but because he was Russian, they withdrew his training and transferred him elsewhere. They didn't want him to continue. So yes, it was difficult.
Right. Any other questions, comments? No? Right. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank Tony Honigbo for stepping into the breach as controller this evening at very short notice. Our next event in the Edgware United Synagogue programme is in 2 weeks' time, on Tuesday, the 23rd of November, where we have a most important session on Lithuanian Holocaust denial by the two leading experts on this topic, Grant Cohen and Celia Foti, live stream from Los Angeles and Chicago. Please make an effort to join us then. The next cantorial session will be on Tuesday, the 7th of December, when our own cousin, Cantor Yossi Schwartz, will tell us about how a cantor is trained in a session entitled The Making of a Professional Cousin. Details of these sessions are placed on our website, www.edgwareu.com, or alternatively, you can contact our office@edgwareu.com, and ask to be placed on the circulation list for the adult education program. Recorded past sessions are on our Edgware US YouTube channel, and this session will be uploaded immediately to YouTube. Among other Armistice talks, you will find on the Edgware US channel are Jewish Women Nurses in World War I by Ronnie's wife Lola from 2020, Armistice Day Centenary in 2018, at which Ron Shelley MBE, former national president of Ajax, was the speaker, and Jewish Life in London in the First World War from 2017, a presentation by British Jews in the First World War. We were there too. Also from earlier in 2017 is a session, Edgware's Jewish World War II Veterans Remember. I'd like to thank Dr. Ronnie Fraser for his fascinating and well-researched talk this evening on the story of British jurors' involvement with the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War. a topic little known to most people. It's important that people know that British Jews served and fully played their part in 2 world wars. As with other sections of British society, they served with courage and bravery, and we too, in Anglo Jewry, lost many of our young men. We will remember them all.
Thank you.